Welcome to our Croatan conversation. We'll be starting in a few minutes. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Sharlene Brown, Senior Fellow and Director of our Racial Equity, Economics, Finance, and Sustainability program here at the Institute. Our program is otherwise referred to as REEF. Thank you for joining today's Croatan conversation on investing in racial equity 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement. This is a part of a larger series of conversations bringing leaders working on the front lines of critical issues at the nexus of finance, social change, and ecological resilience. The Croatan Conversation Series is a project of Croatan Institute, an independent nonprofit research organization working at the intersection where sustainability, finance, and economic development intersect. Just a few housekeeping items. This conversation is being recorded. For all attendees joining by Zoom, please use the Q&A box for all questions. For those of you joining on YouTube, please write your questions in the comment box. We will try to get to all questions at the end of the conversation. Today's discussion is simply for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Investors should always consult with investment professionals before making any investment decisions. I'd like to thank our anchor sponsor, Trillium Asset Management, for making today's session possible. For those of you interested in free sponsorship opportunities, we'll be sharing a link in the chat. So today I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Keith Beverly with GRID 202 Partners, Vicki Lee Parker-High with the North Carolina Business Council, Mike Lear with Capital Group. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, our aim is to discuss the shift from a focus on community development investing to racial equity investing, and to identify areas where impact and social investors can focus their capital to support equitable outcomes for all racial and ethnic groups. Before we dive into our conversation, let me give our speakers a minute or two to do brief self-introductions. So Keith, let me begin with you.
Sure. Thanks, Sharlene. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. My name is Keith Beverly. I'm the Managing Partner and Chief Investment Officer of GRID 202 Partners. We're an independent Black and woman-owned registered investment advisor firm that's based in Washington, D.C., also has a strong presence in North Carolina. Our firm has 3 Black chartered financial analysts, 4 Black certified financial planners, and over 40% of our clients identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color.
Great. Vicki?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vicki Lee Parker-High. I'm the Executive Director for the North Carolina Business Council, and we are a business organization and represent sustainable, socially responsible businesses. We advocate on their behalf on policies through a business lens. We have probably over, 80 or 90 members, but we have a network of over 5,000 companies across North Carolina that we reach out to on a regular basis with our messaging on social responsible businesses. And we look forward to our discussion here today.
Great. Thank you. And Mike? Oh, you're muted.
I thought I hit it, didn't come off. You think I'd have things figured out by 11 months into this. But my name is Michael Lear. I'm a senior vice president, private wealth advisor at Capital Group. Capital Group is one of the world's largest active asset managers with under $2 trillion in assets under management. I work in the private client services group where we manage about $30 billion on behalf of families, endowments, and foundations. Particular to my practice, I'm looking to work with more people of color and support entrepreneurs and their businesses. And a lot of that's through outreach, such as the things I do with Croatan and others. So thanks for allowing me to join the discussion.
Awesome. So as we move forward, I thought it might be helpful to provide some context. So we've looked at some of this data, and I wanted to share that with the audience. So yesterday we celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. And we know that from 1968, his assassination served as a flashpoint in the civil rights movement. But looking forward, we essentially see that there has not been significant progress in the ability of Black communities to build wealth. And as we did an overlay of the historical events and policies that have been implemented throughout this country, one of the things we realize is that those policies have created an enabling environment for some people while allowing other folks to fall to the wayside. So I just want to take a few of those. So if we look at the 1934, the National Housing Act, that act made it permissible for loans to be refused by Black applicants and anyone who sought to live in or near a Black community. If you look at the 1936, the implementation of the Social Security Act, it essentially excluded farm workers and domestic workers or housekeepers who were predominantly Black at the time from participating in the old age benefits and the unemployment insurance program. If you look at the GI Bill, that bill was intended to allow for veterans coming back from World War II to begin to have a fresh start. It allowed for low-cost mortgages, business loans, tuition assistance, and unemployment benefits. But unfortunately, most Black veterans were not able to participate. So we have this period of affirmative action being taken by the US government to support particular groups, while other groups very explicitly were not allowed to participate. You flash forward and you look at the policies of the 1970s, we see that the policies continue to make it difficult for Black Americans to participate in America's economic prosperity. So in essence, as a community, we've struggled to come far, but part of that has been because the environment has not allowed us to participate fully and fairly. Next slide. So recent analysis has shown that even though more African Americans are beginning to access have greater access to educational outcomes, that education is actually not an equalizing force for building wealth. The reality is that wealth tends to turn over with each generation. And there was a generation of white Americans who really had an upper hand because of policies implemented by the US government. Next slide. We also continue to see that Black businesses are struggling more. So data taken from last year during the pandemic reflected that Black businesses were more likely to actually fail compared to white institutions or white organizations, white businesses ran. And actually compared to Hispanics and Asians, we still fared worse. Next slide. And the same thing is true for the employment opportunities. So Blacks continue to struggle more to gain employment opportunities in the market. And so as we sort of think about this particular backdrop, I want to really start by kind of framing a question to you guys about how has systematic racism and discrimination shown up in your line of work? And I'll start with you, Vicki.
Well, I think clearly, obviously, this experience with COVID has revealed just how deep and profound the systemic inequities are. Even myself, and I've been a student of this for a while, I think I was shocked by by some of the revelations and then connecting all the dots. And so it kind of explained, what I've been seeing among minority-owned businesses over the past few years. And, it really kind of helped understand some of the serious struggles they've had to scale, to go beyond just the 1 or 2 employees, but to really become real movers and shakers in the economy. So, what we're seeing, we're seeing that we are seeing it more now with COVID, of course, but also at the same time, we have a deeper and better understanding on some of the real causes of it. And we have words and we're able to kind of express it and articulate it. And some of the data is old and we've seen it, over and over again, but then some of the information has been kind of new, particularly those who just were not aware of how severe the economic injustices are.
And Mike, what about you? How has this shown up in your work?
In a couple different ways, but I would say first and foremost, it's just finding Black clients. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of the achievements of Keith Beverly has accomplished and having 40% of his client base be of color. But one of the challenges, based on the slides you pointed out earlier, is for somebody like myself working in an institution where the account minimums are relatively high at $5 million. It's really challenging to find clients in the Black community that really fit that profile. And so on my side, that's one of the challenges I face. In terms of, I think the question about systemic racism is really important because it's not only internal, but external. I reflect back on some of my experiences of prior institution that I worked for. I went through a whole year. I didn't have a great relationship with my boss, but it wasn't toxic and there was no animosity there. But then in my year-end review, there was comments in there about, Mike doesn't smile that much. And at that point, I was in a trading and portfolio management job. And at the end of the day, it should really be about the work you do. And that should be how you're evaluated, especially in a role such as trading and portfolio management. But what I found was people just, if they're culturally not used to dealing with people of color, it's a real challenge to get ahead. That person wasn't going to be my advocate. That person wasn't going to support me in the ways that I need to support and advance my career. So the challenges are many, but I think we're up for it. Hopefully through education and supporting entrepreneurs, we can close the wealth gap and then hopefully improve all of our businesses.
Great. And Keith, your perspective?
Yeah, and I'll piggyback a bit off of Mike's point around account minimums. That's one of the large barriers I see to households of color really getting access to highly credentialed and fiduciary advisors. So you look at the CFP, CFA community, it's largely on the institutional side, you have these large minimums, and on the private client side, you have these pretty high minimums as well. So that's definitely one of the barriers. One of the other things that we see is just access to best quality and best in class managers and investment opportunities. And again, that gets to the point of do you have enough assets? And if you don't have the assets, you don't have access to the the institutional quality managers and investment opportunities. And the other piece that I'll say is, and when you look at institutions, a lot of institutions, when you think about how ingrained and how entrenched the investment consultants are in that community, there's pretty significant challenges to uprooting a incumbent advisor, and what does that look like for you, and what type of, how realistic is it that you'll be able to come in and shift the mood against that advisor and for them to take what they may perceive as a risk with working with an advisor of color that might not have the same level of assets. So those are a few of the items that that I see out there.
Okay, that's helpful. So it sounds like there's still some issues with what we would refer to as inclusivity. So the door may be open, but it's not always inclusive, and that sometimes simply because of the mechanics of things and the bars that are set, it leaves gaps in our ability to participate because there's no real bridge or pathway for us to do that, particularly for those of you managing money. Okay. So over the last year with COVID and then the Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think we've seen a number of the big companies stepping out and showing their commitment to working with people of color. We've seen those organizations essentially commit significant dollars to trying to make a difference. And so as we think about that, how can those companies support the growth and the vitality of small business owners, especially those of color? Because that seems to be a place in my mind where Black people can actually own their talent and be able to really grow it and value it in a way that helps them to move up the ladder. So I'm going to start with you, Keith.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, do you need to repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was caught up with some background noise. I'm sorry. Or did someone else want to start? And I'll hop in.
I'll go ahead and jump in a little bit. I know because that's something I have tried to track a little bit. There have been some big announcements. We've heard Lowe's, who've recently committed $25 million in grants. Irvin Magic Johnson, $100 million. Netflix has made some pledges, and Pepsi and McDonald's. So we hear these major companies stepping up. Certainly is a good thing. We welcome that. I think again the challenge is just making sure that those dollars get to those businesses that simply need it the most and the most vulnerable, and making certain that whatever criteria they set around, parameters they set around accessing these funds, take in consideration where these companies are. Again, Keith mentioned, having minimums, and it is similar to, that's similar when it comes to accessing capital. Is sometimes they just don't meet the criteria, but then it becomes a catch-22, because how do you begin to get the assets to meet the criteria for some of these things? So, I'm excited that there are companies stepping up. There are many of them. I also want to make sure that that it goes to the most vulnerable businesses and not those that are already thriving, but those who are trying to move to that level.
One thing I'll add there, and we saw this with the recent legislation around the PPP and the EIDL programs, is, I know advisors that work and focus on entrepreneurs that are founders of color, and they have those relationships, so that when the legislation comes in, having advisors and having consultants and people that are already tied into those communities is essential, because you can have the legislation, but the legislation can't be implemented, it can't be rolled out and explained to the people that are set to benefit from it, then it won't have the type of impact that you want it to have and that it could have. So I think having those resources in place, who already have those established relationships with the entrepreneurs, is critical.
Yeah, this is Mike. I would just add on to what Keith and Vicki just said. I think in positions like ours, and I don't want to speak for Keith, but I know being an advisor puts us in a great position to be able to assist entrepreneurs and surround them with a team. So a lot of the work I do is centered around helping entrepreneurs of color create a team around them. So that's investment bankers if they need that. That's bankers if they need that. That's accountants, that's trust and estate attorneys, that's just attorneys in general. But using the network I've built up over decades in order to support those activities, I think is really important, because we don't come to the table many times with those same sort of connections that others have. And I think specifically with this job, when you look at the numbers in terms of financial advisory, there's, depending on whose data you look at, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that there's less than 5% of us of color, advisors of color out there. And I think that's because of some of the challenges we've just been talking about. It's that wealth gap. So it's a chicken and egg problem. So there's the clients don't look, sound, feel like you, but also there's the problem of of just not having the hesitance or not allowing the opportunity for us, for folks in my position, to actually spend the time they need to spend in the communities where there might not be that immediate dollar exchange of value, but where you can really make meaningful strides in helping out these entrepreneurs reach their goals.
So I think one of the things that I'm hearing from this conversation, and I think it's a theme that has certainly repeated itself, is that some amount of money needs to be invested in this sort of bridge infrastructure to work with those entrepreneurs that perhaps are not yet ready, to work with advisors like you, and perhaps in some ways, I'm going to use the word cost share or subsidize, so that those types of businesses can gain services and access to you. And Mike, your balance, your minimum is much higher, but maybe Keith, maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of efforts to sort of make that connection.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do see, or at least that we are seeing now, is that there has been this evolution in fee models, right? So all advisors don't necessarily work strictly under an AUM-based model. For a lot of our clients, we do have the traditional AUM relationships, but we also have more flexibility in how we can, bill clients. And you have hourly models, you have retainer models, and as those types of fee structures start to proliferate, you will see greater access and for quality advisors. So that's definitely one positive trend that we're seeing, and gives us some flexibility as well. The other piece where I think is more realistic is that there's almost a barbell approach where you might have an offering and a service and maybe resources for those that are starting, that are earlier in their asset accumulation journey. And then you have the folks that are already arrived and that are your more typical, ultra high net worth institutional clients, where those clients effectively, subsidize the profit that you don't make on the clients that don't have the income and don't have the net worth just yet. So I think, having that type of approach where, the larger clients can subsidize the smaller clients is something that we try to implement as well. There are also models where you have, at least on the investment side, where you can come in as in a foundation, endowment, or someone that's charitably inclined, and you can offer capital that makes an investment more accessible to folks that might not be accredited investors or might not be large investors, so that your dollars essentially are able to be employed and deployed in a way that you're giving access and opening up financial inclusion opportunities for investors that might not be as wealthy.
So Mike, you're in a much larger entities. Do you see anything like that emerging among the very large organizations or players in the market? This type of pathway that Keith is talking about, where you use the higher end to help to offset to create that pathway.
Yeah, Keith's in an advantageous position as it relates to this, because he's an entrepreneur in the truest sense of the word. He can make the rules. I'm an entrepreneur, so I've got to play within others' boundaries. But with that being the case, I think two of the most important things that are being done is they're being more flexible on minimums. So number one is I get to make the business case and plant the flag with my regional director and say, hey, look, this person may not have 5 million, but I value that relationship. I spent time. This is somebody I know. There's a valuable relationship to me. And now that we've given our directors capacity to make those sort of evaluations. The other thing is, quite frankly, it's like how I spend my time, because these are longer term engagements. So let's just be honest, let's be candid here. Within the Black community, there's a hesitance around the banking finance industries. Those aren't going to be as quick to turn around as other areas might be. So with that, we need to be able to spend more time within our community, supporting them with the knowledge that it's not going to be we can't have quarterly demands put on us as it relates to growing that part of the business. We've got to be a little bit longer term in our thinking. And thankfully, I'm at an organization that allows me to do this. So that allows me to attend some of the Croatan meetings that we have every month, and a lot of the other work that I do in terms of supporting these entrepreneurs. So I think those are the two key points there: being a little bit more flexible, and basing things on relationship better, rather than being hardcore about the minimums, and also expanding your view and allowing folks more time to work in areas that might be a little bit more challenging for all the reasons we've mentioned.
And Vicki, I wanted to see if you can maybe add, how do entrepreneurs find the folks like Mike and Keith? Because I imagine that there is sort of this gap in knowledge as well, in addition to experience.
Yeah, I think that, well, still one, making certain that they get the funding and the assets that they need so that they can bring something to Mike and Keith. So we want to make sure they're financially strong. But yes, also, I think it's also an education component to it. And that's why I think, groups like the North Carolina Business Council is helpful, that we can, inform them of, what these companies do, how they benefit their businesses, and helping them to think, long term. A big part of our work as building sustainable businesses is that very thing, is that I know we have our immediate needs and we have our quarterly needs and annual, but we really want businesses to think, 5 years and out. And part of that is, is learning how to manage our funds on a long-term basis, as well as our other resources, and in developing our businesses. So, I think in that area of teaching them that, we have to have, short-term plan, mid-term plan, but long-term plan. I think that's where teaching them and educating them about companies like Keith and the work that Mike is doing will come into play and be very, very important on how they learn how to make their dollars grow and eventually work for them. I'm hoping that's what you did.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just one last point there. I mean, one of the things that we've been focused on, really trying to be more intentional about, and I think a lot of it was just COVID, and we recognize our position as one of the few Black-owned firms that are out here, but just outreach and doing as much as we can to tap into different communities and share our knowledge is something we've been much more proactive and diligent about, because there aren't a lot of resources. So to the extent we can just get a group of people together and get tens of people or hundreds of people on a call and educate them, that's it makes more sense business wise, and we're also helping with just to provide better financial education.
Awesome. So as I'm watching the questions come in, I do have a question about the role of state and local municipalities in being a part of the ecosystem that supports small businesses. And Vicki, maybe I'll start with you. So how do we ensure that small, medium-sized business have access to any resources that are being developed, as we see lots of states and municipalities actually make commitments around racial equity investing?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the start of your presentation, and you gave that history of the federal policies that undermined minority communities, and then even moving forward in the 70s, and that really showed. I think that's where it really starts. These policies that are put in place by our elected officials, by our appointed officials. We first have to start by having real conversation with the folks that make these policies, to make sure that they are making inclusive policies and not exclusive policies, because that trend continues. We've seen that. So part of what we do is that we have to have businesses engage in that conversation. We have a role to play. We have to hold them accountable. We can't assume that they're going to just do the right thing on our behalf. We just can't make that assumption. So we have to be engaged, and not in a shout it out sort of way, but really simply letting them know, here are, we are here in your community, and these are our needs, and this is how we expect you to, your policies and laws should reflect that. So we have to get comfortable with having those conversations. with our state, our local officials, our state officials, and our congressional leaders as well. We have to have them on speed dial. That's what I tell businesses. You should know who your state representative is. When I moved here from DC, that was one of the first things I looked up, because I'm from DC. Everybody knows there's council members, like, but you should know who your congressional representative is. They should be part of your Rolodex. They should be part of your business plan. Honestly, they should, you should be thinking about who these folks are, what laws are they passing that impact your business, and how do you get into that conversation to make certain that everyone is included in that type of in those policies.
Great, so hold them accountable. So Keith and Mike, I'm going to invite you guys in to, if you have comments.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say our role is slightly different. I mean, at least my role is slightly different. So the way I look at the question is just we're an asset manager. So that's first and foremost where our skill set is. So it's just being really a lot more specific in the questions that our analysts are asking of municipal bond managers. So it's not supporting for-profit prisons. It's really about taking this idea of looking at it through the lens of what you want to see in the world. So having those restrictive covenants and really asking a lot more questions about DE&I when those opportunities come up with our conversations with municipalities.
I'll say Vicki's point about being engaged with your local officials and just elected officials in general is important, because one of the examples I keep coming back to is the opportunity zone legislation, where effectively when you talk about structural racism, when you talk about inequities, you have a piece of legislation that effectively is going to be unequal in how it's structured, because it's the focal point of its capital gains, right? And we've already alluded to the fact that white households have 99% of the assets, and BIPOC households don't. So if legislation hinges on capital gains, then by and large you're going to exclude a large portion of households of color, right? And households of color that, for the most part, the wealth is going to be new wealth. It's not going to be inherited wealth. It's not going to be wealth that was built up over generations, because we've started later, much later start than our white counterparts. So that that notion of how do we have conversations with elected officials so that there may be legislation that seeks to achieve a certain aim and seeks to have an influx of capital into communities that's going to be positive, that's going to be empowering to those communities. But you also want to make sure that you're being equitable in how that legislation is structured and the implementation of that legislation. So those conversations with the elected officials is very important to Vicki's point.
So let's move on to the role of investors. So we know that there is an abundance of social and impact investors out there that are trying very much to get their hands wrapped around this concept of racial equity investing. And maybe if you guys could sort of touch on how is this different from what we've done in the past, which has been community development investing? How should those investors move forward? What are some of the opportunities for them to actually support more equitable outcomes in our society? And I'm going to start with Mike.
Yeah, so I was reflecting on the question over the weekend, and I really think the one of the top things we can do outside of education, which I think is a topic for another conversation, is really about supporting the entrepreneurs, and there are a number of ways to do that. So the organizations that I'm most closely aligned with are Big Path Capital, VC Include, and Camelback Ventures. I'm friends with all the founders, and I think the best way for folks in my position and also investors out there in the audience is to really be supportive of those people who are trying to help out those businesses. I mean, really what it comes down to is we need to have more people making money out there. And there's another one I forgot to mention. It's the Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership. And one of the most interesting things, Jill Johnson, the founder there, or the founding member, puts out there is if you look at she has a nice little chart of all the money that came out of out of Silicon Valley and how it spread, and all the faces didn't look like ours. And we have the capacity and opportunity to do the same sort of things within our community if we're just supportive early on. So really, it's on us to support these organizations in their mission. And for me, it's easy because it's complementary to the work I do. But it's also something that feels good, and there's some great people working in the sector.
Keith?
I'll start here, and I'm biased, but I'm here, Mike's here. There are Black CFAs, Black MBAs that are in the impact space, in the racial equity investing space, that are and have been doing this work for quite some time. So my first recommendation would be to start there, because we do have relationships, and these are people that we've known for quite a bit of time, so we have a pulse on what's going on. But one of the promising aspects of where we are today is that you are in a position where you can apply a racial equity lens across asset classes. So I think the work that you all are doing at Croatan, and looking at what it looks like to apply a racial equity lens across the total portfolio is important, because when we look at a portfolio, and a lot of our clients that come to us that are extremely discerning, and many of them are experts and leading authorities in the DE&I space. And for them, they set a pretty high bar on us, right? And I think a lot of the innovations that we're going to see are going to stem from the clients putting pressure on the consultants, clients putting pressure on advisors to be more critical, to be more thoughtful, to come up with more robust solutions for how they're managing assets. And it really does span across asset classes. So from CDFIs to venture capital, across the risk spectrum. If you're really committed to racial equity, you can exercise that and express that view and express that commitment across your entire portfolio. So now we can get into kind of specific ideas, I guess offline, but there are definitely ways that if you're committed to the work, that it can be reflected in your portfolio.
Can I just jump in? Keith just got me on a whole other thing. But one of the things is for the folks out there, you have agency. Like there's no hesitance on, I'll just take a middle-class white woman, has no problem calling up my company or any other company in the investment services industry and saying, I prefer a female financial advisor. Mm-hmm. Nobody has a problem with that. On the other side of the spectrum, nobody has a problem saying, I want to be divested of oil and extractive technologies. Nobody has a problem saying these things. So we need to be that deliberate in saying, I want to support women and minority entrepreneurs. I would like a Black financial advisor. We should be asking these questions and demanding these things.
Yeah, I was going to add, that's a great point to think about. I was going to add too, in terms of, again, of entrepreneurs and small business and investing, I know there have been some laws even here in North Carolina that allow for, crowdfunding investing for small businesses. However, again, back to some of the policies and some of the requirements and criteria, there are challenges in there that allow people, you have to have a certain level of assets. So again, more minimums to invest. So, there's yet another opportunity where we, need to kind of speak up and look at how we make these laws that are there more equitable so that everybody can participate. This is a great tool, potentially a great tool to support businesses and help them, again, to build their assets. However, when you have policies or laws written, again, that are restrictive, it defeats, it just doesn't allow everyone to participate and take advantage of it. So there are some policies that are out there that are getting there that, have that intention to be inclusive, but there's still these hiccups in there that we need to iron out so that all of us can participate. And again, these are channels that allow us to allow the finances to flow. as they should. And you know, it's a challenge because these gateways have been blocked for so long, and it's to even say we're paying catch up is almost an understatement. It is overwhelming in some instances. So I think at this point, given where we are, given what we know, knowing that there are people like Mike and Keith and there are others out there who have even more knowledge and understand the landscape better, the financial landscape and investing better than we did even 10 years ago. You know, I still say this is the opportunity to keep pulling these resources, mental, intellectual property together so that we can, you know, educate people and really help them understand these roles so that we can, you know, hopefully unlock some of these channels for additional funding.
Great. I want to start taking some of the questions that are coming in a little time. So Andy Loving is asking, so what role do we think Black banks and credit unions will play in this process of Black wealth building?
I'll get started on that one. So Black banks play an important role, but we also need to keep in mind that their size is you know, they're really dwarfed by the large banks, right? So they can't be an entire answer to the wealth gap problem. But you know, we have local banks here in North Carolina, and you know, one of the things that we have seen is a few of the Black banks you know, merging and coming together to try to create scale. And that's important when you're in the banking space, because you need scale in order to operate and in order to compete with the likes of the large banks. But they can play a very important role, from having relationships on the ground with entrepreneurs, you know, providing financing, affordable financing for, you know, vehicle purchases and home buying and the like. I think they can play a very important role, and they're not as capitalized as they could be, and they could definitely you know, benefit from an injection of more capital. So a lot of the conversations, it seems like it's been pretty prominent, you know, part of the conversation right now around, you know, banking Black, and I'm you know, very supportive of it.
Mike, Vicki, anything to add?
I would just leverage off what Keith said. I mean, really, for entrepreneurs, they've got to be out there shopping for Black bankers, or for any banker for that matter, that's going to get them the right loans at the right fees, because that's really the most important thing here. And just realizing there is choice out there. I think, again, it's just finding those resources, connecting with folks like Keith, Vicki, and myself that really have the connections within the community to really get them the capital they need is the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would just add, you know, that I think this past year, I think we're learning more and understanding about CDFIs, the Community Financial Development
Community Development Financial Institutions.
Thank you. Which are designed to lend and provide funding for underserved populations and in underserved communities. And so I know in my space, there's been a big push to fund them more. It's been a big push to get states to be more participatory in funding them and sustaining them so that they can continue to lend. And then there are a number of I think, Black-owned financial institutions that are CDFIs as well. So, you know, I always tell folks, you know, supporting them, understanding that they're growing as an institution as well. So you don't get all of the bells and whistles that you might be accustomed to, but supporting them is a commitment on both ends, and hopefully the idea of more of us support them, then we get more of the features that we are accustomed to. But that's the big issue sometimes that's heard, that you may not get the services that you've been accustomed to from the big banks, but obviously the big banks have been able to do that. So I think we need to be patient, but definitely support them.
Yeah, and maybe I would add to that, Vicki, many years ago, there was a big campaign, 1% for Community campaign. And so the challenge isn't, or the opportunity isn't to put necessarily all of your funds, but if you can at least put a part of your funds and make that sort of part of your commitment to actually helping these banks grow, I think that that would actually go a long way. There is a specific question for you, Vicki. Is there an organization like NCBC in Philadelphia that you would recommend?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I know there are some council counterparts. I would have to double check. I'm not off the top of my head. I'm not familiar. I know there's one in Jersey, but I'm not familiar about Pennsylvania at this point. But I can double check for you and let you know if there's a council, a business council in that area.
And so one of the advisors on the line is asking about how. She says, could you speak how to get people, to get them started and to trust the process of building wealth? And this is, I would just identify her as a white ally. And so there are white allies out there that would be willing to engage with Black and Brown community members and help them to build, get on that road to building wealth. But I think the issue that was pointed out by you, Mike, is that it takes time and we have to be able to build trust because people have been so scarred by the financial system. So what's the how for getting folks to start over?
I mean, Keith, you want to go for it?
Yeah, so where I begin is with the historical context, right? So if a client walks into you and they have, a couple $100,000 or $500,000 in cash, yes, you can go and invest it, but where you probably want to begin is why you have so much cash, right? So same logic, same rationale with where you would begin the conversation with someone that is reticent or doesn't trust the financial system is, I understand why you don't trust the financial system because historically, financial services has been exploitative of households of color for decades and for centuries. So start with that premise and understanding that we recognize that there's been this exploitation, that there's been this predatory relationship between financial services companies and households of color. So how can we then build on that and correct it? And what makes the most sense for you, right? So how can financial instruments, investing, improve your personal situation and help you achieve your financial goals? But always begin with that historical context, because I think it sets it engenders trust, right? So that you're speaking with someone who understands that that you're not your distrust isn't unfounded, that is well merited, that you don't want to bank because you remember that your grandmother had a story about someone that she put money in the bank and she didn't get her money back, right? And she told you, that story and it stuck with you, right? So understanding where some of those reservations come from is the starting point, and then from there you can start to educate and always want to speak to their particular concerns and their situation. But I think starting with that historical context and the history is the first place that I would begin.
Yeah, and just to leverage off what Keith said, knowing the background is incredibly important, and knowing where people are coming from in any conversation is really helpful. But when it comes to like the how, I just say you got to do something, whether it's writing a book, whether it's going to the gym, or in that time of year where everybody's got their resolutions. It just gets started. I've never once responded to a call, an email with "you don't have enough money to talk to me." That's never happened. Never gonna happen. So you should avail yourself of these resources that are out there. Call me, call Keith, like ask questions. You might not have enough money to be a client, but that doesn't mean I don't want to talk to you. It doesn't mean I don't want to support you. I get calls all the time. I don't view it as a waste of time. I view it as iron sharpens iron. Maybe I get better at describing the type of things that I'm trying to express to people from the financial side. It also gets me, for me personally, selfishly, it gets me better at listening, understanding, could get me to other areas I hadn't thought of. Because a lot of my clients aren't necessarily worried about retirement or saving for school. They have other more complex problems, but they all have problems, and how you and how you address them, and how you engage with them is always important. So I would say the biggest thing to get started is just get started, do something. Reach out. I get a bunch of LinkedIn requests every week from people looking for jobs, people looking for information. I do my best to get to all of them. I don't think I've missed one. If I've missed you, I apologize. Reach out again. But yeah, I just think it just gets started.
Great. So we have a question sort of looking forward. So what can be done to maintain the momentum in racial equity investing? And how do we avoid this momentum fading away in the next 4 to 5 years?
I mean, I can go on that one as well. From my side, working at a large institution, it's asking for longer term commitments, and actually we're in the numbers business, so it's asking for those numbers. I'm quite happy that I'm at the organization I'm at. It's not unique in that they're providing more information as it relates to how they're doing, what our scorecard is, where we're trying to go. But it's not even necessarily, it's holding their feet to the fire over the long term, but also setting up the expectations of what that's going to be. It's not going to be a 1-year commitment. It's not George Floyd happens, so we're going to make a donation. We're all cool 6 months later. It's not the way it works. So there's got to be an ongoing commitment to all these areas that we say are important. Like somebody, one of my close friends, Kevin Agandi, posted yesterday. It's live the other 360, like coming out of Martin Luther King holiday yesterday, is live those other 364 days like those posted quotes that you have this one day. So it's living up to those, whatever challenges you're facing, it's living up to those expectations. And you might fall down, but hopefully directionally, you're going the right way.
Yeah, for us, I see our role, again at NCBC and organizations like this is to make sure that we keep the fire going, that we keep these issues in front of people on a regular basis. I sense in my, in my network, I feel that there's a sense to do that, to really hang on to the momentum we see right now amongst our members and, and keep them engaged. I'm hoping that, the people that we're working with and these other, entrepreneurs across the state and other states that I'm working with as well, realize now that we can no longer ever be lulled back to sleep again on these issues. We can no longer sit back and think, well, we voted someone in and now they're just going to go off and do our bidding. I don't, no matter how strong of a person you or candidate that you felt they are, we, again, we the people, we have a role to play. We have to stay, engaged on these things, and we have to, realize that at some level we have to keep ourselves informed and act on that information that we get. My hope is that, businesses that, the ones that I mentioned earlier, Lowe's and McDonald's and all these companies, that this isn't a one-shot deal for them either, and that they see this as a long-term investment in the community, and that this is just a start. And 5 years later, we're hoping that we'll see another round of this, to be honest, because I think that's what's going to be needed to try to make us, even come close to being whole. So,
So
yeah.
I just want to, your comments point directly to one of the questions that has been posted, and I sort of want to piggyback on that and sort of summarize that question, and then add 2 more, just because we're close to the time that we need to be wrapping up. So there's a question: what role do you see for changing federal or state policy? We've rolled back 40 years of policies intended to address racial discrimination. So how do we address discrimination in banking, housing, employment as an underpinning for the ability to build wealth? The other question is about how do we support really small businesses and help them grow? And I think perhaps not necessarily in your professional lives, to Keith and Mike, but sort of where do you see that evolving? One of the ways that people build wealth in this country is through small business ownership, because of the security that can offer. So what's the role of investors in this space, or is there a role? And then lastly, someone is posing a question about a venture that would point towards building a Black Robin Hood app or Black Robin app as a platform and helping Black shareholders incrementally build access to share and I guess investment capital. I'm going to pose those three and then you guys can choose one to answer.
I'll just quickly say on the policy part, again, there are organizations like ours, across, and I've worked with some, and I'll be happy to direct you. But when you see them ask for, you to sign on or meet with your representative, do that. There are groups out here that we're working hard to make sure your issues stay in front of people. So when we need you to come help and step up, take that opportunity to do it.
I'll take the one about investing in small businesses. I would say that I'd say that there are a decent amount of resources out there and different, a fair amount of avenues that people have in order to raise capital, whether it's crowdfunding or going to CDFIs. If you have a great idea and you have some traction, and maybe you go the VC route or the angel investment route. But I do think that there's a greater awareness of the need to invest in Black-owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color. And it becomes a matter of how do you identify the right source of capital that makes the most sense for your business and what you're looking to do. Like every business isn't a good business to receive or to even pursue venture capital funding, because every business isn't built that way. Every business isn't built to grow 10x, 20x, where a VC type of investment makes sense. But there are plenty of businesses that can grow at a healthy clip and do well financially for the business owners, for the employees, and for debt holders, or for even for investors. So I think identifying the type of capital that makes sense for your business is important. Then also knowing that there are lots of different resources out there for for diverse owned companies, diverse owned businesses.
Yeah, and I'm reflecting on the same question. I had to go reread it. But I think it's out there networking. I came across the Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership. Happened to be my neighbor, Jill Johnson, who's running it. And she also does the making of Black Angels. So it's being out there, knowing that those groups are out there, and just Googling, seeing what's around in your community, being part of it. A lot of times I'll attend ACG or other meetings just for information, just to know who's out there, just to know who's in my local community doing things that I'm interested in. So I hate to put it out there like this, but it's being a sponge. Like if you're an entrepreneur, you're in charge of your business, so you got to be excited about going out there every day and sucking up all the knowledge that you can. And I think that's the easiest way to get that done for those smaller entrepreneurs that are building those businesses that will eventually hopefully become larger businesses and come work with Keith and I.
Great. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank you guys again, Keith, Mike, Vicki, for joining me in this conversation today. I think this was very enlightening and certainly takes us in hope. I've learned some and I've taken a lot of notes in terms of where we can go and how I can incorporate some of this. And I suspect that we might have some follow-up emails, so I may very well be in touch. I'd also like to thank Trillium Asset Management again for providing the sponsorship for Reefs and making today's session possible. And thank our attendees for joining us in this conversation. If you are interested in supporting a Croatan conversation, there are a number of ways to do so. We take corporate sponsorships, so certainly reach out to your company and say, hey, I attended one of these, really enjoyed it, and would love for us to be a sponsor. You can also make a donation directly to the Institute, and we are more than happy to receive feedback or topics of suggestions. So please complete the form at the end of this conversation, or feel free to email us at conversations@croataninstitute.org. And again, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Sharlene.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.